Reformed Faces Session 5. This session has to do with the hymnals that Reformed churches use. Somebody may ask this question: you Reformed churches, which hymns do you sing for worship? Which hymnals do you use for your worship services? Why is it that I heard that some Reformed churches only sing the Psalms, and other Reformed churches only sing Psalms and classical hymns? As for myself, I grew up singing youth hymns, Christian Missionary Alliance in Hong Kong, 青年圣歌, or someone would say I grew up singing campus hymns, 校园诗歌 in Taiwan, or somebody in Singapore might say I grew up singing 赞美诗 from the CNEC, Christian Nationals Evangelistic Crusade, later on renamed. CNEC was originally Chinese Native Evangelistic Crusade, later renamed Christian Nationals Evangelism Commission. Or for some brethren, I grew up singing 万民颂扬. I grew up singing these traditional hymns. Why do you Reformed people, or some of them, sing only the Psalms and classical hymns? First, we need to go back to Reformation history and look at two principles in interpreting the Bible. The first principle is called adiophora, Adiophora. Adiophora are things that the Bible never explicitly commanded, or things that the Bible never explicitly prohibit. Lutherans and Anglicans would say that if the Bible never forbids something, then it is free for us to choose to do so. So, for example, in Germany, in the Lutheran churches, they preserved the structure, the outline of the Mass. They took out the wrong doctrines. They don't pray to Mary. They don't pray for dead people. They do not consider the Lord's Supper to be re-sacrificing Jesus Christ. They take away the wrong doctrines. They removed the statues, the idols, but they kept the Mass, the sequence of prayers and readings and singing. Over against this view is something called the regulative principle. The regulative principle states that we only do those things which the Bible has directly commanded or has given an example. So these are two different ways to interpret, or we might say two different ways to apply what the Bible teaches about worship. And so when it comes to the Puritans and some Scottish Presbyterians, some of them would say how they would interpret Colossians chapter 3, verses 15 to 17. They would say that psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs refer to psalms, and psalms. So this is where you get the practice by some denominations, such as the Reformed Presbyterian Church of North America, RPCNA, where they only sing the psalms with no musical instruments. So first of all, there are these two ways of looking at the Bible. Now, let's take a look at the history of hymnals, or history of hymns. We will go very briefly. First of all, Lutherans. Martin Luther and the Lutheran Church had this very formal Mass, and J.S. Bach wrote many chorales for Lutheran worship. On the other hand, Luther also wrote some very simple hymns, even children's hymns. Over against the Lutheran way was the Zwinglian way, which is very simple worship services: prayer, one song, sermon. Calvin followed the example of Martin Bucer, and so in Reformed churches, you have the practice of singing the Psalms, putting the Psalms into meter form, which can be sung. Calvin learned this when he was expelled from Geneva and went to Strasbourg, France, and was taken in by Martin Bucer. Martin Bucer, I would call him a Calvinist before Calvin. He was older than Calvin, took him in, and assigned Calvin to pastor the French refugee church in Geneva. And that's where Calvin heard his fellow French men and women singing the Psalms in a godly, in a joyful spirit. And so he then asked certain French people to write the Psalms into singable form. That's where you get the singing of Psalms. At the end of the Puritan period, 1710, and then during the revival of the 1730s and 40s, you have very important hymn writers in the Reformed tradition, Isaac Watts and John Newton. Isaac Watts wrote some Psalms or Psalter selections, but he also broke away from the Psalter tradition and began to write some Psalms freely using words that are not direct quotations from the Psalms. Isaac Watts, the father of English hymns, and John Newton, who wrote hymns really for prayer meetings, which he held in his church in Olney, O-L-N-E-Y. So Isaac Watts was the fruit of the Puritan period. John Newton, very much part of the Great Awakening or the Evangelical Awakening in England. Charles Wesley, another Great Awakening leader, was a lover of hymns. His brother, of course, Charles Wesley, wrote thousands of hymns. So you see, when you have Reformation and revival, hymn writers arose. New hymns were written. We then move on to the 19th century, where after Immanuel Kant, you have liberal theology, you have romantic art and music, and now people began to write hymns much more freely even than, say, John Newton and Charles Wesley. And so you get a new kind of, actually two or three kinds of new kinds of hymn writing in the 19th century. Toward the end of the 19th century, you have the gospel song, featuring, of course, the most famous authors of them, Fanny Crosby, the blind woman poet. So you have psalms, hymns, gospel songs. Now, the gospel song is what we evangelical Christians call traditional hymns. Most of them are really of the gospel song category. Jesus and me in personal relationship. We don't forget that the Black American churches passed down through the centuries Negro spirituals. And then by the 1960s and 70s, we have the last wave of the gospel song and the first wave of the folk rock contemporary worship songs, names such as John W. Peterson and then Bill Gaither, Ralph Carmichael. That would be the transition from gospel song to, let's say, Vineyard and Maranatha much later in the 1980s and 90s. Now, when missionaries arrived in China, most of them took the approach of cooperation and lowest common denominator. So most Chinese Christians, various denominations, learned some of the 19th century hymns as well as gospel songs. A few, particularly Fujian, Xiamen, churches learned the Psalms. The Lutherans learned the Lutheran hymns and chorales. And so the lines begin to blur, not to mention the fact that Chinese Christians, there were some creative writers of new words and new music. And then in the last 30 years, you have new writers, new hymns, new songs from China, from Taiwan, from Hong Kong, from North America, and from Southeast Asia. So here's a brief history of the hymns, and we, of course, have a whole series on the history of hymns in another course. So Reformed churches, just like any other churches, have inherited the Psalms, hymns of Isaac Watts, John Newton, Charles Wesley, Fanny Crosby, and many other of these 19th century authors. Now let's take a look at hymns and culture. On the one hand, some Reformed churches want to, quote, stick close to the Bible and only sing those hymns that they think the Bible directly commanded them to sing. On the other hand, in my view, we must come to terms with the fact that the hymns that we sing for worship, are deeply influenced by the culture outside the church, especially in the 19th and 20th century. My own experience has been that the church very often would put up a great resistance against the popular music of their day, beginning with John Calvin, who really didn't want to sing at all in church because he thought that these song melodies were really come from dance halls and taverns and we shouldn't have anything to do with them, until he listened to his own French people sing in Strasbourg. Likewise, for the longest time, evangelicals resisted popular music, let's say popular music of the 1940s, a big band, folk rock, early rock and roll, and so on. But the fact is that these genres, these styles, old pop, big band, folk rock, gradually made their way into the church through the creative writing of people like John W. Peterson, Ralph Carmichael, Bill Gaithert, and so on. And so gradually, the church adopted these newer songs into the worship service. For example, we sing Majesty, which is written by a charismatic pastor, Jack Hayford, and Majesty appears in some of our hymnals, 2 or 3 verses. And so, on the one hand, the church begins to adopt musical styles from secular culture. On the other hand, you have revival movements in church history. Both of these bring new life into the history of hymns, into the very hymnal that we buy and adopt as churches. However, when Chinese begin to rediscover the Reformed faith, we get so excited about things Reformed, from Taiwan to Indonesia, we begin to make certain subcultural relative things to be absolute truth. And so we begin to reject contemporary worship music and sing only psalms or classical hymns. My own view follows the stance of John M. Frame, my teacher, is that we need to stop this worship war. We lost the war a long time ago, and begin to learn to understand, respect, appreciate the hymns and the songs written from the very many different traditions in church history. The Church of Jesus Christ is a global church. I had the wonderful opportunity to teach many African pastors at International Theological Seminary in Los Angeles in the 2000s and 2010s. So one time, as I was interacting with a PCA pastor from the southern part of the United States teaching in Taipei, he asked me whether Chinese music traditionally had melody, harmony, and rhythm. I said, of course it does. And then I asked him, does God accept the worship of African churches? How do we distinguish things that are absolute and things that are relative? How may we begin to see that some of the things we do and we hold on to are really subcultural elements in a big global church movement, which we call Reformed and Presbyterian churches, not to mention the global church that goes back to the early church in the Middle Ages and all the way spans about 1900 years.